You know his laugh before you know his name, green hair, white face, a smile carved too wide to be real. He walks into a room and the temperature drops. But here is the part nobody tells you. The blueprint for that laugh was not invented in a comic book office. It was recorded on tape inside a university basement by a psychologist who was not trying to create a villain at all. He was trying to understand you. In 1971, a young researcher at Stanford wanted to know something simple. Not why bad people do bad things, why good people do them. His name was Philip Zimbardo, and he built a fake prison in the basement of the psychology building. He took ordinary college students, healthy, screened, unremarkable, and split them into two groups. Guards, prisoners, no script, no direction on how to act. Just a uniform, a role, and a room with no windows. Within 36 hours, something broke. Not the prisoners, the guards. Grown, gentle young men began inventing punishments nobody taught them. Humiliation games, sleep deprivation. One guard started speaking in a slow, theatrical drawl, smiling while he handed out cruelty like it was a gift. Zimbardo had to shut the entire study down after 6 days. It was supposed to run 2 weeks. Here is the question underneath all of this. What happens to a person when the role they are given rewards the worst version of themselves? Zimbardo called it deindividuation. Strip away someone's name, hand them a costume, a title, an audience, and the identity underneath starts to dissolve. What replaces it is whatever the role demands. Sit with that for a second, because that is not a comic book theory. That is a documented psychological mechanism. And somewhere between that basement in Palo Alto and a movie script decades later, a very specific kind of villain started to take shape. Not a man with a tragic backstory seeking revenge. A man who discovered that the mask lets you become something you were never allowed to be. The character most people call the greatest comic book villain ever written was never given an origin story in his most iconic form. No radioactive accident, no dead parents. In one telling, he says he remembers it differently every time. That is not a writing mistake. That is the entire point. A fixed identity is fragile. A blank one is terrifying because it means anyone underneath the makeup could be capable of it. Psychologists have a term for why this unsettles you so deeply. It is called the uncanny disruption of moral schema. Your brain is wired to sort people fast. Good, bad, safe, threat. A villain with a clear motive fits neatly into a box, and boxes feel manageable. But a character who commits horror for no reason you can name, who seems to enjoy the chaos itself rather than any goal it serves, breaks the sorting system. Your mind keeps searching for the plan. There is no plan. That absence is the actual horror. Now here is where it gets stranger. Zimbardo was not the only researcher whose work bleeds into this character. 10 years earlier, another psychologist ran an experiment that became even more famous, for even darker reasons. Stanley Milgram, at Yale, wanted to know if ordinary Americans would electrocute a stranger just because a man in a lab coat told them to. Volunteers were told to deliver increasingly severe electric shocks to another person in a different room, whenever that person answered a question wrong. The shocks were fake. The screams were recorded actors. The volunteers did not know that. 65% of them delivered what they believed was a lethal shock. Not because they were monsters, because an authority figure standing calmly beside them said, "Please continue. The experiment requires you to go on." Milgram's chilling discovery was not that cruelty needs a villain. It is that cruelty barely needs permission, a voice of authority, a uniform, a clipboard. That is often enough. Do you see where this is going yet? The character audiences find endlessly fascinating is not compelling because he is powerful. He is compelling because he understood something Milgram proved in a lab. Ordinary people do not need much of a push to abandon their own morality. One version of the character spends an entire film trying to prove exactly that, engineering situations where regular citizens are handed an impossible choice, waiting to see how quickly the mask of civilization slips. That is not evil for its own sake in the writing room. That is a dramatization of real, replicated behavioral science. The writers were not inventing a monster from nothing. They were reflecting findings that had already been proven, uncomfortably on real human subjects decades earlier. There is a third piece to this puzzle, and it belongs to an actor rather than a scientist, though what he did to prepare for the role sits right on the edge of psychological experiment. Before filming his version of the character, the actor reportedly isolated himself for weeks, kept a journal in the character's voice, disrupted his own sleep patterns, and refused to let the persona leave when the camera stopped. Method acting, taken to an extreme, is essentially a self-run psychological trial. You are deliberately triggering the same de-individuation Zimbardo documented, except instead of a prison guard uniform, the costume is a suit and grease paint. And instead of an institution assigning the role, the actor assigns it to himself. Performance psychologists have studied this exact phenomenon in actors who play villains for extended periods. Some report genuine difficulty reintegrating their sense of self after a shoot ends. The mechanism is identical to what happened in that Stanford basement. Wear the mask long enough, reward the persona with enough attention and reaction, and the line between performance and identity gets thin, fast. So why do you love him? Why does a character built from a fake prison experiment, an electric shock study, and an actor's self-imposed psychological breakdown end up as one of the most beloved figures in modern pop culture? Because somewhere underneath the fear, you recognize something true. You have felt the pull of anonymity. Maybe not in a mask, but in a comment section, in a crowd, in a moment where nobody was watching closely enough to hold you to your usual self. Zimbardo's guards were not monsters before the experiment. They were college students. Milgram's volunteers were not sadists. They were ordinary neighbors following an instruction. The character on screen simply asked the question out loud that both experiments answered quietly. What would you become if the right circumstances gave you permission? That is the real reason the laugh gets under your skin. It is not because he represents something alien to you. It is because, according to two of the most replicated studies in the history of psychology, he represents something disturbingly reachable. The uniform changes. The role stays the same. Give a person enough anonymity, enough authority pointing them forward, enough audience watching and rewarding the performance, and the transformation Zimbardo watched happen in 6 days starts to look less like fiction and more like a documented, repeatable outcome. The character was never meant to be understood. He was meant to be recognized. And once you see the basement, the shock generator, and the actor's unraveling journal sitting underneath the makeup, you cannot unsee it. He was never a villain invented from nothing. He was an experiment result wearing a smile.